needed to get out. Now. She stumbled from her seat, her ribs screaming in protest. The floor was tilted at a grotesque angle, littered with the ghosts of their journey. A scattered deck of playing cards, an overturned champagne flute, a single leather shoe. She pushed her way through a gaping hole where a window used to be, her legs catching on torn wires and jagged metal. When she was finally free of the wreckage, her knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the damp, mossy ground. The forest was dense, a towering, indifferent cathedral of green. It was alive, breathing around her, and utterly, terrifyingly unknown. That's when she heard it. A low groan. Human. Ayla's head snapped toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs. A few yards away, slumped against the base of an ancient oak tree, was Sebastian Ashbourne, her boss. The man whose cold indifference had been the bane of her professional life for 2 years. He was bleeding. The impeccable navy suit he always wore, the one that served as his corporate armor, was torn at the shoulder. A deep gash on his forehead wept a steady stream of blood that traced a path down his temple and dripped from his jaw onto the dark soil. But it wasn't the blood that shocked her. It was his expression. For the first time since she had joined Ashbourne Industries, Ayla saw him stripped of his power. The formidable fortress had crumbled. He wasn't issuing orders. He wasn't scowling with that familiar, icy disapproval. He was just breathing, raggedly, fighting to anchor himself back in the world. His eyes found hers, and a current of raw recognition passed between them. It wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude. It was the stark, shared knowledge of what they had just survived. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a rough rasp, but it was focused. There was no panic in it, only a tightly controlled urgency. Ayla blinked, the sound of his voice pulling her back from the edge. I don't think so." Her own voice was a thin, reedy thing, a stranger's voice. Sebastian tried to push himself up, his body betraying him as he swayed. On pure instinct, Ayla scrambled to her feet and rushed to his side, her hands grabbing his arm to steady him. A rush shot through her before she could even understand why. She had never touched him before. Not a handshake, not a brush in the hallway. The fabric of his suit was rough under her fingers, his arm beneath it hard as stone. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. They stood there for a moment, suspended in the eerie quiet of the forest, the sounds of birds and the whisper of wind through the canopy slowly returning. Sebastian's gaze swept the area, his mind already working. Ayla could see it in his eyes, the shift from victim to strategist. "We need to check for other survivors," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its natural authority. But it was different. It wasn't an order. It was a statement of fact, almost a request for her to agree. Ayla nodded, her mind still reeling. Together they moved through the wreckage, calling out names that were answered only by the echoing silence. There was no one, just the two of them. As the crushing reality descended, Ayla felt the ground tilt beneath her feet again. They were alone, stranded in a wilderness with no communication, no sign of rescue, and the only other soul for miles was the man she was sure she could never stand. Sebastian turned to her, wiping a smear of blood from his brow with the back of his torn sleeve. His gaze met hers, and for the first time, Ayla saw something that frightened her more than the fall. It was pure, unyielding determination. "We are going to survive this," he said, his voice low but solid as bedrock. "I promise you." And in that moment, Ayla realized a dreadful, undeniable thing. She believed him. And honestly, who wouldn't? After surviving something like that, you'd believe anyone who promised you a way out. Let's see if he can keep that promise. The fire was the first miracle. Ayla watched, a sense of profound disbelief washing over her, as Sebastian Ashbourne knelt on the damp forest floor. He moved with a focused, almost surgical precision, stripping bark from a dry branch with a shard of metal from the wreckage, gathering tinder with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. These were the same hands she had only ever seen gliding over an iPad to approve multi-million-dollar contracts or typing curt, dismissive emails that could end a career in under 10 words. Now, they were smudged with dirt, scratched and raw, working to coax life from friction and wood. He didn't complain. He didn't even sigh in frustration. He just worked.
How do you know how to do that?
The question slipped out before she could stop it, her voice sounding small in the vast quiet of the woods. He didn't look up, his concentration absolute. The muscles in his forearm tensed under the rolled-up sleeve of his ruined shirt as he began to rub a spindle against a fireboard he had fashioned.
My father,
he answered, his voice neutral, a low rumble against the whisper of wood on wood.
He believed a man should know how to survive with nothing but what the world gave him.
A wisp of smoke, thin and gray, curled upwards. Ayla held her breath. Sebastian leaned in, blowing gently, protectively. A tiny spark glowed, an ember of impossible hope in the twilight. Then another, and suddenly, a small, fragile flame flickered to life, dancing between his cupped hands. He looked at the flame for a long moment, and in the soft, golden light, Ayla saw the tension in his shoulders ease by a fraction. He had brought light back into the darkness. I have to say, for a guy she hated so much, he was proving to be surprisingly useful, wasn't he? They established a crude camp near the wreckage, a small pocket of order against the encroaching chaos of the wilderness. Sebastian orchestrated everything with a chilling efficiency that was both alien and deeply reassuring. He salvaged a large, partially intact piece of the cabin's interior lining, and with a length of wire he'd stripped from a seat, he rigged a makeshift lean-to between two thick trees. Ayla tried to help, to be useful, but she felt clumsy and out of her depth. Every task she thought of, he was already 3 steps ahead. She gathered wood, but he had already found a fallen log that was drier. She tried to sort through the salvageable items, but he had already prioritized water, shelter, and warmth. "Do you know how to tie a taut line hitch?" he asked suddenly, holding up a length of cord he had scavenged. "Not exactly," she admitted, feeling a familiar flush of inadequacy. "It's all right. I'll show you." And he did. He stood behind her, his voice low and patient as he guided her hands through the loops and pulls. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cooling air. The scent of wood smoke now clung to him, mingling with that faint, expensive cologne that was somehow still there. His fingers brushed against hers as he adjusted the knot, and a jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "Why are you being like this?" The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered. He paused, his hands stilling on the rope. He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the deepening shadows. "Like what?" "So different." Sebastian let go of the rope and turned to face her fully. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the flickering firelight. Then, he let out a slow breath and sat on a log near the fire. "In the office, I am what the board expects me to be," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "What my uncle molded me into after my parents died." He paused, the name of his uncle hanging in the air like a chill. "Here, there's no room for that. There are no board members, no stock prices. There is only this." He gestured vaguely at the dark, looming trees around them. "Only survival." That night, the temperature plummeted. A cold, damp chill seeped from the ground, relentless and invasive. Ayla huddled by the fire, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. But the shivering was a deep, internal tremor she couldn't control. She bit her lip, refusing to complain, refusing to show the weakness she felt. But he noticed. Of course he noticed. Sebastian Ashbourne noticed everything. Without a word, he stood up, took off his torn suit jacket, the last remaining layer he had, and walked over to her. He held it out. "No!" she protested immediately, her teeth chattering. "You'll freeze." "I'm warmer than you are." It was a simple statement of fact. Sebastian. Ayla. His voice was firm, cutting through her protest, but it lacked its usual icy edge. It was just certain. Please. She looked up at him, at the genuine concern etched onto his face, a face she had only ever seen set in a mask of cool authority. And something inside her shifted, a tectonic plate of long-held animosity grinding into a new position. Slowly, her hands reached out and took the jacket. She pulled it over her shoulders. The fabric was still warm from his body, and it carried his scent, smoke, the forest, and something uniquely, indefinably him. It felt like a shield. He gave a single sharp nod and returned to his spot on the other side of the fire, rubbing his arms against the cold. Ayla watched him, a painful knot tightening in her chest. It was a confusing tangle of guilt, gratitude, and something else, something warmer and far more dangerous. "Thank you," she whispered across the flames. He just inclined his head, his eyes already heavy with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to weigh him down. Ayla couldn't sleep. She watched the fire spit and crackle, a lone beacon against the oppressive living darkness of the forest. And she watched Sebastian. He was shivering. He was trying to hide it, his movements small and controlled, but in the stark, dancing light of the fire, she could see the tremors running through his body. Before she could second-guess the impulse, before logic could intervene, she was on her feet. Clutching the jacket, she walked around the fire and sat down beside him. The ground was cold and hard beneath her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep, his eyes still closed. "Sharing." She draped the jacket over both of them, a makeshift blanket, huddling close enough that their shoulders and hips pressed together. The shared space was instantly warmer. Sebastian's eyes opened. They were dark pools in the firelight, reflecting the flames. He looked at her, then at the jacket covering them, then back at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know." A heavy silence fell, filled only by the sound of the fire and the distant call of some nocturnal creature. Then, so slowly she almost didn't feel it, he leaned into her, a subtle shift of weight, an acceptance, a surrender. Ayla's heart began to beat a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was acutely aware of every point of contact, his shoulder against hers, his thigh against hers, the steady, solid presence of him. She hated Sebastian Ashbourne. She had built 2 years of her professional life around the certainty of that hatred. It was a solid, dependable thing. But the man shivering beside her, the man who had given her his last layer of warmth, the man who was now trusting her enough to lean on her, she had to admit she had no idea who that man was. And as she sat there, sharing a jacket and a sliver of warmth under a canopy of unfamiliar stars, an impossible, terrifying thought began to bloom in the darkness of her mind. She wasn't sure she hated him at all anymore. Ayla woke to the smell of roasting fish and the alien sound of birdsong. For a disorienting moment, her mind clung to the memory of her warm bed, her small apartment, the familiar city sounds. Then, the reality of her situation returned with a jolt. The dull ache in her back from sleeping on the hard ground, the chill in the air, the heavy weight of Sebastian's jacket still draped over her. She sat up, her movements stiff. Across the dying embers of the fire, Sebastian was crouched by a small, clear stream she hadn't noticed before. He was turning 2 small, silver-skinned fish skewered on green branches over a fire he'd somehow coaxed back to life from the night's embers. "You fished?" The words came out raspy. He glanced over his shoulder, and for the first time, Ayla saw something she would have sworn was impossible on the face of Sebastian Ashbourne. A smile. It wasn't his corporate, predatory smile. This one was small, hesitant, almost shy. It barely touched his lips, but it lit his eyes. "Woke up early," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Found the stream about 200 yards that way." Ayla blinked, pushing her tangled hair out of her face. "And you?" You caught fish? With your hands? Improvisation, he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He lifted one of the sticks from the fire, the fish sizzling, its skin perfectly crisped. Eat. We need the energy. They fell into an unspoken routine, a rhythm dictated by the sun and their shared need to survive. It was a strange, silent partnership. Sebastian, with his relentless focus, took charge of securing the camp and exploring for a way out. He was the hunter, the protector. Ayla, who had a degree in graphic design but a secret lifelong passion for botany passed down from her grandmother, became the gatherer. And just like that, they weren't boss and employee anymore. They were something else entirely, something forged by necessity. It's amazing what people can become when the world falls away, isn't it? She began to explore the flora around them, her grandmother's lessons echoing in her mind. She found broad, waxy leaves that, when layered, could help waterproof their lean-to. She identified edible roots, painstakingly cross-referencing them with the memories of sketches in her grandmother's old notebooks. She even found a plant with soft, pulpy leaves that she knew had antiseptic properties. "How do you know all this?" Sebastian asked later that day. He was sitting patiently on a log while she cleaned the gash on his forehead, which was beginning to look angry and inflamed. "My grandmother," Ayla answered softly, her focus entirely on the task. She had crushed the leaves into a green paste, just as she'd been taught. She believed nature has an answer for everything, if you just know where to look. He was quiet as she worked, so still that it made her own racing heart feel ridiculously loud in the silence. She was so close, closer than she had been even when he'd taught her the knot. She could feel the warmth of his skin, see the faint stubble shadowing his jaw, the tiny, almost invisible scar just above his eyebrow she'd never noticed before. She saw the vulnerability in the way his eyes tracked her movements. Her fingers were gentle as she applied the poultice to his skin. When she finished, her hand lingered for a fraction of a second too long, her thumb brushing against his temple. His breath hitched. Their eyes met. The air between them, already thin at this altitude, suddenly felt thick, charged with a new and unpredictable current. Ayla pulled her hand back quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and took a step away. Later that afternoon, while gathering a fresh supply of firewood deeper in the woods, Sebastian stopped dead. He held up a hand, his body instantly alert. "Listen." Ayla froze, her own senses straining. "What is it?" The silence. She focused, and then she understood. The constant chatter of birds had ceased. The rustle of small animals in the undergrowth was gone. The entire forest had gone unnervingly still. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was an unnatural one, like the world was holding its breath. "Sebastian," she whispered. A strange shiver ran down her back, as if her body knew before her mind did. "Stay behind me." He didn't have to say it twice. Ayla moved, her back pressing against his as he scanned the dense trees around them. And then they saw it. Imprinted in a patch of soft mud near the stream were paw prints. They were huge, larger than her own hand, with deep, menacing claw marks pressed into the earth. "What kind of animal leaves a track that big?" Ayla's voice was a choked whisper. Sebastian knelt, his fingers hovering over the edge of the print, his expression grim. "Something large, feline." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what roamed the deep woods in this part of the world. Cougar, panther. They returned to the camp in a tense, hurried silence. Sebastian didn't speak, but his actions were loud. He built the fire up, creating a larger, more formidable circle of light. He took the sharpest piece of metal he had salvaged from the wreckage and began methodically honing its edge against a flat stone, crafting a crude but deadly-looking spear. "We'll take watches tonight," he said, his voice calm, but with an underlying firmness that left no room for argument. "I'll take the first shift. When I wake you, you take over." Ayla nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. But as night fell, wrapping the forest in a suffocating blanket of darkness, sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Her imagination painted terrifying shapes in the shadows just beyond the fire's reach. And then she heard it. It was distant but unmistakable, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath them. It was a sound of pure, predatory power. Ayla's eyes shot open. She sat bolt upright, her gaze darting to Sebastian. He was already on his feet, the makeshift spear held tight in his hand, his body a tense silhouette against the flames. His eyes were locked on the impenetrable darkness beyond their camp. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice a low command that barely disturbed the air. Ayla held her breath, her body paralyzed with fear. And then, for a split second, she saw them. Two yellow eyes, glowing like embers in the pitch black, reflecting the firelight. They were watching, calculating. The Black Panther. Sebastian shifted his body, a single deliberate movement that placed him squarely between Ayla and the unseen threat. He became a wall of flesh and bone against the coming darkness. "If I tell you to run," he said, his voice low and lethal, his eyes never leaving the spot where the eyes had been. "You run. Do you understand?" "I'm not leaving you, Ayla." He turned his head just enough for her to see his profile, carved from stone and shadow. "Promise me." Tears of terror burned at the back of her eyes, but before she could answer, the panther took a single, deliberate step out of the darkness, its sleek, powerful body emerging into the firelight. And Sebastian moved to meet it. Sebastian didn't charge with the spear. He attacked with fire. In one swift, fluid motion, he lunged toward the fire pit, grabbed a thick, burning branch, and hurled it into the darkness just in front of the panther. The log landed with a shower of sparks and a loud hiss, casting a wild, dancing light. The massive cat recoiled, a deep, furious snarl ripping from its chest, its yellow eyes blazing with indignation. "Get back!" Sebastian's voice was a raw, primal roar that tore through the forest, a sound so full of command and fury it seemed to shake the very trees. Ayla stared, frozen, as the man she knew as a cold, calculating CEO transformed into something elemental, something wild, a protector. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed another burning branch, then another, flinging them in a strategic arc, creating a flickering, temporary wall of fire between their small camp and the creature. The panther paced back and forth, its sleek, black body a ripple of muscle and menace. It was trapped between its predatory instinct and its primal fear of the flames. It let out one last frustrated roar, a sound that vibrated deep in Ayla's bones. And then, with a flick of its tail, it melted back into the shadows. It was gone. But Ayla knew, with a chilling certainty, it wasn't far. It was out there, waiting. The rest of the night was a waking nightmare. Sebastian did not sit. He did not rest. He stood sentinel at the edge of the firelight, the metal spear held tight in his grip, his eyes constantly scanning the oppressive darkness. He methodically fed the fire, keeping the flames high and bright, a solitary guardian against the terrors of the night. Ayla tried to stay awake with him, her own fear a sharp, bitter taste in her mouth. But the adrenaline crash, combined with days of physical and emotional exhaustion, was a tide she couldn't fight. Her head drooped. Her eyelids grew heavy, and eventually she slumped against a log and fell into a fitful, dream-haunted sleep filled with images of yellow eyes and glistening teeth. She woke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the canopy. The first thing she saw was Sebastian. He was still there, still standing, still awake. He was leaning against a tree now, the spear resting at his side, but his posture was rigid, his gaze still fixed on the surrounding woods. You didn't sleep?" Ayla scrambled to her feet, a pang of guilt and awe tightening her chest. "Couldn't risk it," he said, his voice rough and strained. "Sebastian, you have to rest. I'm fine." But the slight tremor in his hands and the dark, bruised look under his eyes told a different story. He pushed himself off the tree, and his exhaustion was plain to see. He swayed, catching himself with a hand against the rough bark. Ayla closed the distance between them, her hand instinctively going to his arm to steady him. "You're not fine. You need to sleep. I'll keep watch." "Ayla, you don't know. I know how to feed a fire, and I know how to scream." She met his gaze, her own expression firm, leaving no room for argument. "Let me take care of you, just for a few hours." He looked at her for a long, searching moment, his defenses warring with his body's desperate need for rest. Finally, with a slow, reluctant exhale, he gave a single, sharp nod. "A few hours. Only." He lay down near the fire, and Ayla expected him to be asleep before his head hit the bundled leaves she'd arranged as a pillow. But he wasn't. He lay there, his body still tense, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. "I can't," he admitted, his voice a low rasp of frustration. "I can't switch it off." Without thinking, without allowing herself to hesitate, Ayla sat down on the ground beside him. And then she did something that surprised them both. She reached out and took his hand. Sebastian went utterly still. His eyes flew open, wide and startled, locking onto hers. His hand was cold in hers, but it was strong, his long fingers calloused from his work during the night. "I'm right here," Ayla said softly, her voice a gentle anchor in the quiet morning. "Nothing is going to happen. I'll wake you if I see anything." He stared at their joined hands as if he'd never seen them before. Then, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, his fingers curled, lacing through hers. The connection was solid. Real. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered, his gaze lifting to her face. Ayla didn't have an answer that made sense. Or maybe she did, and that was what scared her. "Because you would do the same for me," she finally replied, the words feeling truer than anything she had said in years. A flicker of something, gratitude, surprise, relief, softened the hard lines of his face. And for the first time since the plane had fallen from the sky, he let his guard down completely. His eyes drifted shut, and with his hand held securely in hers, he finally slept. 3 hours later, Ayla was still sitting beside him, her back against a log, her own exhaustion a dull, distant ache. She watched the steady rise and fall of his chest. She noticed the way sleep smoothed the harsh lines of concentration from his face, making him look younger, almost vulnerable. She was still holding his hand, and she had no desire to let go. When Sebastian finally stirred, the sun was high in the sky, casting dappled light through the leaves. He blinked, disoriented, and the first thing he seemed to register was the warmth of her hand still holding his. He looked at their entwined fingers, then at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them moved to pull away. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with sleep and something else she couldn't quite name. "Always," Ayla heard herself say, the word feeling both reckless and right. In that quiet moment, something fundamental shifted between them. They weren't boss and employee anymore. They weren't even just partners in survival. They were something else, something more dangerous, something inevitable. Sebastian slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, but he didn't release her hand. "Ayla," he began, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something." Her heart gave a painful lurch. "What?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling with the words. "Back at the office, the way I was." He paused, his gaze dropping to their hands. "I never wanted to be that person. Especially not with you. I didn't know how to be anything else." "Why?" she whispered. "Because my uncle taught me that caring is a weakness, that a leader can't be kind, that an Ashbourne can never show." He trailed off, his voice cracking on the last word. "Show what?" she prompted gently. Sebastian looked up, and in the raw, unguarded depths of his eyes, Ayla saw everything. The crushing loneliness, the weight of a legacy he never asked for. The cold, empty prison he had built around himself. That he cares, he finally said, and Ayla's world, which had already been turned upside down once, tilted on its axis all over again. That evening, the sky broke open. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a deluge, a sudden violent downpour that hammered the forest canopy. The makeshift lean-to Sebastian had built shuddered under the assault, and within minutes, cold water began to drip, then stream through the gaps. The fire hissed and sputtered, fighting a losing battle against the onslaught before finally dying with a defeated sigh, plunging their small camp into a deeper, more profound darkness. They were soaked in seconds. A brutal, bone-deep cold set in, far worse than the night before. "We have to stay warm," Sebastian said, his voice tight, cutting through the roar of the rain. "Hypothermia is a real threat." He didn't wait for her to agree. He pulled her into the driest corner of the shelter, turning his back to the worst of the wind and wrapping his arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest. Ayla didn't resist. Her body was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. His body, though also cold and wet, was a solid, living furnace against the storm. They huddled together, two survivors clinging to each other for warmth, the distinction between them dissolving in the shared, desperate need to endure. And in the roaring darkness, cocooned together against the storm, Sebastian began to talk. "My parents died when I was 15, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor against the chaos of the wind and rain. "Car accident. My uncle took me in. He took over the company, too." Ayla listened in silence, her ear pressed against his chest, feeling the vibration of his words as much as hearing them. Each word was a confession, a piece of a puzzle she was only just beginning to understand. "He told me I had to be strong, that the world was full of predators, and if I showed any weakness, they would tear me apart." He took a shaky breath. "So I learned. I learned to build walls. I learned to treat everything like a transaction. I learned to never, ever let anyone see that something, or someone, mattered." He shifted, his arms tightening around her. "At the office, you always looked at me like I was a monster." Ayla's chest ached. And you were right." He cut her off, his voice rough with self-loathing. "I was. My uncle always said it's better to be feared and respected than to be liked and seen as weak. Sebastian. But here." He lifted a hand, his cold fingers finding her cheek, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. The simple, tender gesture was a stark contrast to the violence of the storm. "Here, I can't pretend anymore. And the truth is, I hate the man I became, but I don't know how to be anyone else." Ayla covered his hand with her own, pressing it against her face, holding it there. "Maybe you don't have to learn," she whispered. "Maybe you just have to remember. Remember the person you were before your uncle told you who to be." She paused, her eyes, even in the near-total darkness, trying to find his. The person who would face down a panther to protect someone. The person who would stay up all night in the cold. That's the real you, Sebastian. Not the machine in the suit. The world seemed to shrink to the tiny, fragile space they occupied. Sebastian stared down at her, his eyes searching her face for something. Permission, maybe. Or absolution. "I hated you," Ayla confessed suddenly, the words pouring out of her carried on the tide of the storm. "Back in that life, I hated you so much. You were cold and demanding, and you never once said thank you. I thought you were an empty suit, a man with no soul." She took a ragged breath. "But you're not. You're here, keeping me alive, teaching me, protecting me. And I don't know what to feel anymore, because everything I thought I knew about you was wrong." Sebastian closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his face as if her words were physical blows. "Ayla, let me finish." She brought her other hand up, framing his face, forcing him to look at her. "You are not the man I thought you were, and that terrifies me. Because now I see you. And you are," she struggled for the word, "you're extraordinary." His breath hitched. "I'm not. You are. Ayla, you don't understand. When we get back, if we get back, I have to be that man again. My uncle, the board, the company, they all expect." "Then don't go back," she said, her voice fierce. "Not to that. Be this person. The real Sebastian, not the one the world demands." He looked at her as if she had just offered him the sun and the moon. And maybe she had. "What if I don't know who the real Sebastian is anymore?" he whispered, his vulnerability a raw, open wound. Ayla managed a small, gentle smile. "My grandmother used to say that as long as you're breathing, you have time to figure it out. You just have to want to." The rain continued to fall, a steady rhythmic drumming on their shelter. But inside, a different storm was brewing. Sebastian leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against hers. Their breaths mingled in the cold air. "If I kiss you now," he said, his voice a hoarse, desperate rasp, "there's no going back from it. I won't be able to pretend it didn't happen." Ayla's heart was beating so hard, she was sure he could feel it through her chest. "Then don't pretend," she whispered against his lips. And Sebastian broke. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation, of a man who had been lost in a desert and had finally found water. It was raw and consuming, freighted with all the fear and hope and terror of the past few days. Ayla melted against him, her hands tangling in his wet hair, pulling him closer, meeting his desperation with her own. The kiss tasted of rain and survival, and everything they hadn't been able to say. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, he didn't let her go. He held her tight against his chest, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had fallen apart. "I don't want to be that man anymore," he murmured into her hair, his voice a solemn vow made to the storm. "For the first time in my life, I want to choose." And that night, as the rain washed the world clean, two strangers became something more, something that neither the forest nor the world that waited for them could ever undo. When the rain finally stopped the next morning, leaving the forest washed clean and glistening, a new resolve had settled between them. The kiss had changed everything. The air was no longer thick with unspoken tension, but with the quiet, humming energy of a shared, undeniable truth. Sebastian was the first to break the silence. "We can't stay here," he said, his eyes scanning the dense woods. "We're too exposed, and we're running out of time." He looked toward the highest peak in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the pale morning sky. "We have to get to high ground. If we can build a signal fire up there, a big one, we have a chance. A real chance." Ayla followed his gaze. The mountain looked impossibly far, its slopes steep and treacherous. "Do you think we can make it?" Sebastian turned to her, and his hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers with a natural, possessive ease. "Together?" he said, the word a promise. "Yes?" That single word, together, sent a wave of warmth through her chest, chasing away the last of the morning chill. They spent the day preparing. The work was different now. It was a coordinated dance, no longer just him leading and her following. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, their movements punctuated by small smiles and casual touches, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing as they passed a tool. Sebastian fashioned 2 makeshift backpacks from the salvaged cabin lining. They packed what little they had, a plastic bottle now filled with rainwater, the last of the edible roots Ayla had found, the crude spear, and the fire-starting kit. You're different, Ayla commented as she helped him adjust the strap on his pack. He paused, his gaze steady on her. You are too. She tilted her head. How? In the office, he said, his voice soft. You always seem to be holding your breath. You walked with your shoulders hunched, like you were trying to take up as little space as possible. His eyes softened, a gentle light warming their gray depths. Out here, you shine. Ayla felt a blush creep up her neck. Maybe that's because out here, I'm not just the invisible designer. I'm necessary. You were always necessary, Sebastian said, his voice low and serious. I was just too blind to see it. The first part of the journey was deceptively easy. The forest floor was relatively clear, and the incline was gentle. But as they began to ascend, the woods grew darker, the trees thicker, their ancient branches tangling together to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The sounds of the forest changed, becoming more muted, more watchful. And then Ayla saw it. Sebastian. Her voice was a strangled whisper. He was instantly at her side, his body tense. What is it? With a trembling hand, she pointed to the ground. Half buried in the damp earth and moss was a bone. It was yellowed with age, cracked and weathered, but it was unmistakably human. A femur. Sebastian's blood ran cold. That can't be. But before he could finish the thought, his foot came down on something that didn't belong. Not a rock, not a root. There was a sharp, metallic click, and the world flipped upside down. Ayla screamed as Sebastian was violently yanked into the air, a thick rope snare tightening around his ankle. He was left dangling, suspended 3 meters from the ground, swinging like a pendulum. Sebastian! She shrieked, scrambling toward him. No! He yelled back, his voice strained with pain and a new, terrifying urgency. Ayla! Get out of here! Run! What? I'm not leaving you! And then she heard it. Drums. A steady rhythmic beat, distant at first, but growing closer with every frantic beat of her own heart. Sebastian's face, already pale, lost all color. Ayla, listen to me. You have to hide. Now. Not without you. Please. His voice broke, a sound of pure desperation. If they find you too, we have no chance. Hide. And don't come out until you're sure it's safe. I'll get out of this, I swear. I'll come back for you, she sobbed, her mind reeling. I promise. Ayla! But she was already gone, scrambling behind a massive, gnarled tree, her body pressed flat against the rough bark. Her heart was pounding, almost trying to break free from her chest, a frantic counterpoint to the approaching drums. A cold sweat broke out across her skin. Her survival instincts, honed over the past week, were screaming at her. Danger, primal, human danger. The drumming grew louder, more insistent, and then they appeared, emerging from the trees like spirits of the forest. Figures adorned with crude paint and animal skins. Faces obscured by carved wooden masks that seemed to stare with hollow, lifeless eyes. They carried spears tipped with sharpened stone. A tribe. An uncontacted tribe. They surrounded the spot where Sebastian hung, their voices a low, guttural chant in a language Ayla had never heard. One of them poked the snare with the butt of his spear, making Sebastian swing. They laughed, a chilling, joyless sound. Then, with coordinated, practiced movements, one of them sliced through the rope with a stone knife. Sebastian fell to the forest floor with a sickening thud. Before he could even gasp for air, they were on him, binding his hands and feet with rough, fibrous cords. Ayla clamped a hand over her own mouth, stifling a scream. The tribesmen hoisted Sebastian onto their shoulders and began to march back the way they came, their drumming and chanting resuming. As they disappeared into the dense green, the last thing Ayla saw was Sebastian's face. He turned his head, his eyes desperately searching the trees until they found her hiding spot. His look wasn't one of fear. It was a silent, desperate command. Survive. Ayla didn't know how long she remained pressed against the tree, frozen. It could have been minutes or an hour. The world had shrunk to the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic, wild drumming of her heart against her ribs. He was gone. Taken. The forest, which had been a neutral, indifferent wilderness, now felt actively hostile, filled with a danger she couldn't fight. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Her lungs burned, and no matter how deeply she gasped, it felt like she was breathing water. An anxiety attack. Her body was flooded with adrenaline, her instincts screaming at her to run, to hide, to disappear. But then, another image pushed through the terror. Sebastian, standing between her and the panther, his body a shield. Sebastian, awake all night, a solitary guardian. Sebastian, kissing her in the rain as if he were trying to memorize the feel of being alive. A fierce, protective rage, hotter than any fear, ignited in her soul. I'm coming for you. The thought was a vow. She pushed herself away from the tree, her limbs trembling but obedient. She had to do something, and she had to do it now. Following the trail the tribe had left was terrifyingly easy. They had made no effort to hide their passage. Broken branches, deep impressions in the mud, the occasional discarded piece of fibrous cord, they moved through their forest with the confidence of apex predators. Every snap of a twig made Ayla flinch, her heart leaping into her throat. But she forced herself forward, one step at a time, her mind a mantra of Sebastian's face, his voice, his touch. She would save him, or she would die trying. The trail led her to the edge of a large, unnatural clearing. She dropped to her belly in the undergrowth, peering through a screen of ferns. What she saw made her breath catch. A village, not just a few huts, but a sprawling settlement of thatched roof structures, smoke curling from a dozen small fires, and people, dozens of them, moving about their daily tasks, their voices a low, alien hum.